As May 1945 dawned across the grey waters of the North Atlantic, the once mighty German Kriegsmarine had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. After nearly 6 years of war, Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker and the advancing Allied armies marked the inevitable end of the Third Reich. For Admiral Dönitz, suddenly elevated to lead what remained of the German state, the final duty would be the most painful: surrendering the fleet he had commanded. In the closing days of the European conflict, Dönitz issued his last orders to the scattered remnants of German naval forces. U-boats at sea were instructed to surface, hoist black flags, and approach Allied vessels. Surface ships were to maintain position and await further instructions. For the proud officers of the Kriegsmarine, these messages arrived like a death sentence to their professional lives. Aboard the German destroyer Z-29, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein received the surrender instructions with grim resolve. The sleek vessel, once part of the feared German destroyer flotillas that had harassed Allied shipping, now sat anchored in a Norwegian fjord, low on fuel and with limited operational capability. Hartenstein gathered his officers in the wardroom, their faces ashen, as he outlined what would come next. "We will surrender the ship with honor," he told them, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "We have fought as sailors, and we will end as sailors." The men around him nodded silently. Many had served since the war's early days, through the triumphant Blitzkrieg years, when German naval power seemed unstoppable, through the gradual turning of the tide as Allied production, technology, and tactics overwhelmed them. Now they faced the ultimate humiliation, sailing their vessel into enemy hands. That night, in cramped officer quarters, many wrote what they believed might be final letters home. Intelligence reports and rumors suggested that Allied forces planned war crimes trials. Would naval officers be among those charged? Nobody knew for certain. Some burned personal papers and photographs, not wanting them to fall into enemy hands. Others meticulously organized their service records, clinging to the professional identity that had defined them. Hey there, viewers! If you're enjoying this deep dive into this lesser-known moment of World War II history, please hit that subscribe button to catch more stories like this one. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know which historical events you'd like us to explore next. Now, back to those final tense days of the Kriegsmarine. The Kriegsmarine had operated under a unique code throughout the conflict. Despite being part of Nazi Germany's war machine, many naval officers maintained they fought a clean war, adhering to traditional naval protocols, even as other branches of the Wehrmacht became implicated in atrocities. They had rescued survivors from torpedoed ships when possible and maintained professional respect for their Allied counterparts. Whether this would count for anything now remained to be seen. Across the North Sea, British naval forces prepared for the incoming German surrenders. Royal Navy Commander James Wilford received orders to oversee the surrender of several German vessels, including Z-29. Intelligence briefings outlined strict protocols. German crews would be separated from officers. Vessels would be thoroughly searched for sabotage or hidden weapons, and all technical documentation was to be secured. "We expect sullen compliance," noted one briefing document. "German naval pride runs deep. Be vigilant for any last acts of defiance." And the British established a designated anchorage where German vessels would be received, processed, and their crews detained. Armed boarding parties rehearsed procedures, while intelligence officers prepared interrogation protocols for the incoming officers. The atmosphere was one of cautious victory. The enemy was defeated, but not yet fully subdued. For Hartenstein and his men, the final voyage brought a storm of emotions. Following precise Allied instructions transmitted in the clear, Z-29 raised a large black flag, the symbol of surrender, and proceeded at reduced speed toward British waters. As Norway's coastline faded behind them, many officers stood silently at the rails, contemplating what awaited them. Would they face public humiliation, internment in prisoner camps, criminal charges? The ship's engineer, Oberleutnant Karl Meyer, later recorded in his diary, "We sail into uncertainty with heavy hearts but clear consciences. We did our duty as we understood it. Now history will judge us, but first the British will." Radio silence was maintained except for required position reports. The destroyer's weapon systems had been disabled as instructed, ammunition secured below decks. Documents detailed the ship's operational history, maintenance records, and technical specifications, all to be surrendered intact. As the British coast appeared on the horizon, Hartenstein ordered his men to prepare for the formal surrender. Dress uniforms were donned. Despite many being worn and faded after years of war, boots were polished one final time. The German naval ensign, still flying alongside the black surrender flag, would be lowered for the last time upon arrival. What the Germans could not know as they approached the British naval base was that their reception would defy all their expectations. The professional courtesy that would await them would stand in stark contrast to the shame they had prepared themselves to endure. The coming hours would reveal that even in total defeat, the respect between naval adversaries would transcend the bitter divisions of a world at war. The grey spring dawn broke over the British naval base at Loch Ryan on the western coast of Scotland. Royal Navy personnel moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what would be one of the most significant ceremonies of the European conflict's conclusion. Signal flags snapped in the brisk May breeze as HMS Ajax stood at anchor, her war-worn hull bearing the scars of Atlantic battles and Mediterranean campaigns. On the horizon, the distinctive silhouettes of German U-boats appeared, moving slowly toward their final destination. The submarines approached in a single column, each flying a black flag of surrender as required by Allied protocols. Through binoculars, British officers could make out the rigid figures of German naval personnel standing at attention on the conning towers. "They're coming in, exactly according to procedure," noted Lieutenant Commander William Harrington, checking his watch against the precise schedule that had been established for the surrender. Typical German precision, even in defeat. Below decks on U-826, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein straightened his dress uniform one final time. The immaculate blue fabric, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, and his Iron Cross represented the last vestiges of pride for an officer whose submarine service had been his life's work. "Remember," he told his officers in a low voice, "we conduct ourselves with dignity. We are not defeated men, but professional sailors following orders." Despite his confident words, Hartenstein and his officers harbored deep concerns about their reception. Stories had circulated through the remaining German forces about public humiliation of surrendering troops. Some feared they would be paraded before jeering crowds or immediately transferred to prison camps without the professional courtesy traditionally extended between military forces. As the lead U-boat docked at the designated berth, Royal Navy shore parties moved into position. The British boarding teams consisted of technical specialists, intelligence officers, and security personnel, all under strict orders to maintain military discipline and professionalism. "Attention on deck!" called out Commander James Weatherby as the German officers emerged from the conning tower. The British officer stepped forward with a formal salute, a gesture that visibly surprised the surrendering Germans, who had expected contempt rather than military courtesy. "Captain Lieutenant, I am authorized to accept your formal surrender," Weatherby stated. "Please present your vessel's documentation and prepare your crew for debriefing." What followed was a meticulous process rather than the anticipated humiliation. British technical teams moved through each U-boat with clipboards and cameras, documenting innovations and engineering solutions. Of particular interest were the snorkel systems, advanced torpedo technology, and the sophisticated sound-dampening measures that had made the Type Vasti 1 U-boat so formidable. "Remarkable craftsmanship," murmured Lieutenant Howard Phillips, the engineering officer examining U-826's diesel propulsion system. "Even with critical material shortages, they've maintained exceptional manufacturing standards." In the captain's quarters, intelligence officers reviewed logbooks, charts, and operational orders. Rather than treating these as evidence of crimes, the British professionals engaged with them as valuable historical and technical records. "Your navigation through the North Channel minefields in March was extraordinarily precise," commented Lieutenant Commander Davis to Hartenstein as they reviewed patrol charts. "Our tracking stations lost you for 17 days. Throughout the inspection, the atmosphere gradually shifted from tense formality to professional engagement. German engineers found themselves explaining technical solutions to appreciative British counterparts. Navigation officers discussed Atlantic weather patterns and current mapping. Radio operators compared encryption challenges. By mid-afternoon, the technical inspections were concluding when Commander Weatherby approached the assembled German officers. They stiffened, expecting the moment when the relatively civil proceedings would give way to the harsh realities of captivity. "Gentlemen," Weatherby began, "your vessels will remain here under guard. You and your senior officers, however, are requested to accompany me to headquarters for further debriefing." The Germans exchanged glances. This seemed to confirm their fears of interrogation and possible separation from their crews. Hartenstein nodded stoically, and the group followed Weatherby up the dock toward the stone administrative building overlooking the harbour. Inside, they were led not to an interrogation room, but to a wood-panelled conference room, where several British naval officers in dress uniform stood waiting. A table had been prepared with nautical charts showing U-boat operation zones and Allied convoy routes. "Before we proceed with formal processing," said Captain Richard Talmadge, the base commander, "we would like to review certain engagements where your forces encountered ours. There are technical and tactical questions that would benefit both our understanding of the naval war." For the next 2 hours, German and British officers stood together over the charts, discussing specific encounters. British officers asked about particular U-boat tactics, while respectfully acknowledging the extreme conditions under which the German submariners had operated. "The supply run you attempted to the Japanese naval base at Penang in '44, noted Commander Litchfield, pointing to a route marked across the Indian Ocean, "was extraordinarily ambitious given your fuel constraints and our air coverage." Hartenstein explained the calculated risks they had taken, the technical modifications made to extend range, and the navigational challenges overcome. Rather than being treated as enemies, the German officers found themselves engaged as professional mariners, discussing shared challenges of operating complex vessels in hostile environments. "Your submariners maintained operational discipline despite fuel shortages, depth charge improvements, and our radar advantages," observed Captain Talmadge. "While we fought on opposing sides, we recognize professional seamanship when we see it." As the afternoon light began to fade over Loch Ryan, the technical discussions concluded. The German officers steeled themselves for what they assumed would be the inevitable transfer to detention facilities. Instead, Captain Talmadge consulted his watch and made an unexpected announcement. "Gentlemen, it's nearly 1800 hours. I believe our officers' mess is preparing dinner. You will join us, of course." The invitation hung in the air as the Germans struggled to process its meaning. After years of bitter Atlantic warfare and the complete collapse of the Third Reich, being invited to dine with their captors seemed almost incomprehensible. "Captain, I'm not sure I understand," Hartenstein finally responded. "It's quite simple, Kapitan Leutnant," Talmadge replied. "Before you become prisoners of war, you are naval officers, and in the Royal Navy we maintain certain traditions, even in victory." As they followed their British counterparts toward the officers' mess, the German naval officers exchanged glances of guarded surprise. The war had ended in total defeat for Germany, yet here in this remote Scottish harbour, something unexpected was occurring, a moment of professional recognition that would stand in stark contrast to the political realities awaiting them. The doors to the officers' mess opened, revealing a formal dining room where white-jacketed stewards stood at attention, and places had been set for both British and German officers alike. As the formalities of surrender concluded, an unexpected moment broke through the ritual of defeat. A British naval officer approached the senior German commander and spoke quietly but clearly. "The officers' mess will be open this evening. We would be honored if you and your senior staff would join us." The German officers exchanged confused glances. This was not the treatment they had anticipated. Hours earlier, they had been preparing for public humiliation, imprisonment, perhaps even summary judgment for their part in the war. Instead, they found themselves being escorted through a Royal Navy facility toward the officers' wardroom. The atmosphere in the British officers' mess was subdued but not hostile. Naval uniforms of opposing sides mingled in a room where, just days before, maps tracking enemy positions would have hung on the walls. The Germans entered stiffly, uncertain of protocol in this unprecedented situation. Admiral Sir James Somerville, who had commanded British forces against the Kriegsmarine in several engagements, rose as the German officers entered. The room fell silent as he lifted his glass. "Gentlemen," he began, "today we are no longer enemies. But while we were, you fought with skill and honor on the high seas. Your seamanship and courage were never in question." The German officers stood motionless, many unable to comprehend this recognition from their former adversaries. After years of Goebbels' propaganda depicting the British as vengeful and uncompromising, this display of professional respect was jarring. The British admiral continued, "To the men of the Kriegsmarine, who fought for their country as we fought for ours, the sea knows no nationality, only good sailors and bad." Glasses were raised across the room. After a moment's hesitation, the German officers raised theirs in return. It was a toast not to victory or defeat, but to a brotherhood of the sea that transcended the politics that had set them against each other. Lieutenant Commander Erich Topp, who had commanded U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic, later recalled this moment in his memoirs. "We had prepared ourselves for hatred. Instead, we found professional recognition. It was as if we had crossed some invisible boundary where the war ended and humanity began again." The evening progressed with cautious conversation. A British officer who had survived the sinking of HMS Hood asked detailed questions about the Bismarck's fire control systems. German submarine commanders found themselves discussing Atlantic weather patterns with convoy escorts who had hunted them mercilessly for years. Technical discussions replaced political divisions, if only for a few hours. These conversations revealed a mutual respect that had developed during the naval war. British officers acknowledged German technical innovations, the acoustic torpedoes, snorkel systems, and the Type Tit U-boats that had nearly arrived too late to change the war's outcome. German officers expressed admiration for British radar advances and convoy tactics that had ultimately won the Battle of the Atlantic. "Your Enigma codes were broken, you know," one British intelligence officer revealed to his startled German counterparts, explaining for the first time how convoy routes had been adjusted with advanced knowledge of U-boat positions. One British captain described the moment to a war correspondent the following day. "We didn't toast their ideology or their cause. We recognize their seamanship, their courage in terrible conditions, their devotion to duty. These are qualities any naval officer understands. For the German officers, this recognition provided a critical psychological bridge between their wartime identity and an uncertain future. Many had defined themselves through naval service since their teenage years at the Naval Academy in Mürwik. The prospect of returning to a destroyed homeland as despised representatives of a criminal regime had filled them with dread. Not all Allied forces extended such professional courtesy. American and Soviet approaches to German surrenders often reflected harder attitudes. But within the traditions of naval service, particularly between the British and German navies, these moments of recognition were not uncommon. Captain Friedrich Guggenberger, who had survived the sinking of U-513 and spent time in American captivity, later wrote, "That evening showed us that while Germany was destroyed, we as individuals might still find our way back to the community of nations. It was the first moment since our surrender that I felt I might have a future." The historical significance of these gestures extended beyond the immediate moment. In the years following the war, former Kriegsmarine officers played important roles in rebuilding Germany's naval forces within NATO. The professional bridges established during surrender ceremonies helped facilitate Germany's eventual reintegration into Western military structures. Admiral Dönitz, the last leader of the Third Reich who had commanded the U-boat force, noted in his post-war writings that this professional respect between naval adversaries stood in stark contrast to the ideological hatreds that had driven the conflict on land and in the political sphere. By morning, the German officers returned to their status as prisoners of war. Many faced interrogation, denazification proceedings, and uncertain futures. But something fundamental had changed in their outlook. They had been recognized not as representatives of a criminal regime, but as professional naval officers who had done their duty under extraordinary circumstances. When the German ships were eventually redistributed among the Allied powers or scuttled in Operation Deadlight, their crews watched their vessels disappear beneath the waves with complex emotions. But the memory of that unexpected evening, when former enemies had toasted them as worthy adversaries rather than defeated foes, remained a powerful counterpoint to the shame of surrender. This moment of humanity amid the ruins of war demonstrated that even after the most bitter conflict in human history, professional respect could survive where political ideologies had failed. It was a small but significant step toward the healing that would eventually allow former enemies to stand together as allies.